Hi, welcome everyone. This is our final talk for the 2022 NRM conference, and I'm delighted to have you here. I'm also very happy to have Tobias Krettenauer as our speaker today. He's going to have some very interesting things to say to us today, and on a topic that I think is really important to us and valuable. So to reiterate, this is our last meeting this year, and we'll have to let you know about the plans for next year's meeting. But this will be a good way to finish up. So Tobias Krettenauer was trained at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development and the Free University in Berlin. He's now a professor in the developmental psychology faculty at Wilfrid Laurier University. His research interests are in moral development, especially in the interplay of cognitive, emotional, and personality development as they relate to moral conduct and moral consciousness. Dr. Krettenauer has recently taken a deeper interest in moral identity development. He's going to share some of his thoughts about that with us today. Just so you know, he's also the associate editor of the Journal of Moral Education and a consulting editor for child development. So we're honored to have you here with us today, Tobias, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Blaine. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you, of course, for inviting me to present at the second annual conference of the network. And thank you, everyone, for joining in today. Although we're a small group, I totally agree with Blaine that it's not quantity, but it's really quality that matters here. And so far, we really had 3 presentations in this conference, online conference, that were of great kind of extraordinary quality, I would think. It's also the timing of this content that really is great for me. I mean, after 2 long teaching terms, fall and winter, I really long for some intellectual stimulation, and this is what I exactly got over the last couple of weeks. And I hope I can add a little bit to this, at least today. So I'm going to talk about moral identity from a psychological perspective. Moral identity certainly is a concept that is more deeply rooted in psychology than philosophy, but I do think that it has connections, or we can make connections to important philosophical concepts like virtue, character, and also personhood, selfhood. And I hope that we will be able to somehow pull some of these things out, maybe in our discussion. So the network of research on morality is decidedly cross-disciplinary. We want to cross disciplinary boundaries. And so is Dan McAdams. Jack Bowenham's better than me. Dan McAdams, who actually crosses disciplinary boundaries when he promotes or proposes what he calls the art and science of personality research. Dan McAdams, in a couple of papers, and then ultimately in a book that came out in 2015, argued that when we want to consider personality, people, individual people, we have to look at least at 3 layers. I mean, personality consists of 3 layers, as he says. Basically, we as individuals are actors who perform pre-written scripts that might be societal roles, but then McAdams also expands it and says there are kind of temperamental characteristics. We hear it from our parents that are also a part of this actor performing on a stage. Then we are agents. We pursue goals and projects throughout our lives, and we are authors. We constantly tell and retell life stories for different audiences and different purposes. All these 3 layers together constitute the whole person. And McAdams, although does not go that far to say we really have to bring them together in an integrated framework to study the whole person. He says personality psychology consists basically of 3 relatively independent areas of inquiry. We look at what people, or how people behave, how they act, and then we studying behavioral dispositions and traits in interactions with situations maybe. We look at what people want, what goal orientations, values, ideals they have, and we look at what people tell, what narratives and life stories they come up with. Now, a little bit inspired by this model of McAdams, I some time ago, together with my student, Stephen Hertz, came up with the idea that the same tripartite distinction also can be applied to moral identity. And just for those of you who are not really familiar with this literature, the working definition of moral identity could be something like the importance of morality for individuals' sense of self, very broadly conceived. Moral identity can be approached or studied as a trait-like attribute. It can be studied as a goal orientation and a narrative. I have to rush in here with some important qualifications. Of course, traits, goals, and narratives are not sufficient for moral identity. You may have certain traits, but that do not do anything to your moral identity. I'm very much with Erickson here and would say identity essentially is the sense of temporal, spatial coherence and continuity people experience as persons, and morality might be particularly useful for constructing identity, but it is not necessary either. That is an important qualification. Now, let me quickly talk a little bit about moral identity as trait and as narrative, and then zoom in on moral identity as goal. There is evidence that moral identity is a trait-like personality characteristic, or if you don't like the word trait, you can also say has chronic accessibility. Just recently came out with a paper, a daily diary study I did together with Sam Hardy and others, where we used a daily assessment of the self-importance of core moral attributes, such as being honest, being fair, being caring. And we asked people every day over 50 days, so over the last 24 hours, how important was it for you to be honest, to be fair, to be caring? And we found that 64% of the variability in daily scores were due to stable individual differences, whereas 36% were due to daily fluctuations. And in comparison to personality traits, this is pretty high, we could say. I mean, William Fleeson in his studies showed that using experience sampling methodology, personality factors, big five personality factors, have about 30 to 50% between person variability. So yes, it is legitimate to conceptualize moral identity as a trait-like personality attribute, but we also have to acknowledge it evidences fluctuations, daily fluctuations, and situational fluctuations. Turning to narratives, we do know very well from research in Colby, William Damon, and others have done that individuals' moral identity show up in narratives, in the life stories they tell. Now, this was research on individuals who showed extraordinary moral commitments over their lifetimes. And Colby and Damon show that these individuals integrate communal and agentic themes in a kind of unique, integrative way, something also Jeremy Freimer and Larry Walker confirmed using sort of different methodologies. Now, these narratives are about big stories, the big life stories, but we also see connections between moral identity and narratives on a level of small stories, the kind of autobiographical memories people have about past events, moral or immoral actions of my own past. And I would call this aspect autobiographical reasoning, and we do see that autobiographical reasoning is connected to individuals' moral identity. There are various ways you can connect your own past actions with your current sense of self. You can disconnect these two things and say, oh, well, this was the past, has nothing to do with the way I am right now. Or you can make connections and say, okay, yes, it shows continuity. It shows that I always have been a certain type of person, or it shows how much I changed in the past, from what I did in the past, especially the bad things, to what I'm doing now. I see improvement. I see that actually I changed. We do see that these various ways of connecting your own past with your current moral identity is related. And we can see that clearly more identity manifests in individual life stories, big and small. Now, we can say that more identity has been studied as a trait-like personality attribute and as a narrative with some success. But interestingly, it has rarely been investigated as a goal orientation, the middle level in Dan McAdams' kind of three-layer approach. And that is interesting, and in some extent also a kind of limitation in my view. I think that every researcher who's interested in more identity has to somehow tackle or faces three fundamental questions. And these questions were already described by Sam Hardy and Gus Gallo in a kind of seminal paper that appeared some time ago. Namely, first, what is a more identity? Not so much in terms of a verbal definition, but how do we want to conceptualize it from a kind of psychological point of view? Second question, how does more identity motivate more action? This is one of the core tenets, that more identity has an important motivational function for action, for more action. And third, how does more identity develop? It's clear that babies are not born with a more identity. It is a feature, a quality that emerges in the course of development. And we have to ask ourselves, of course, how does that happen? And how does it develop? And how does it change over the life course? And my tenet, and this is something I want to explain today, and maybe hopefully can convince you to some extent, that conceptualizing more identity as the goal or as a goal motivation actually provides an integrated framework for addressing these three fundamental questions of more identity research in, I would say, elegant way. So here's what I want to do in the next 45 or 40 minutes. First, I want to talk a little bit about conceptualizing more identity as goal motivation. The basic idea is that people have many different identity goals, but there is one goal that stands out, namely the goal to be or wanting to be a more person. This is a goal everyone has, but where people differ also developmentally is with regard to the characteristics that are attached to this goal. More identity goal can be avoidance or approach oriented. It can be externally or internally motivated. It can be concrete or abstract. And these goal characteristics really matter when it comes to understanding the effectiveness of more identity in motivating more action, because this effectiveness depends to some extent on the goal characteristics that are involved. That becomes particularly kind of obvious when I look into what I call undermining effects. There's a general assumption, and I think there's some truth to that assumption, that more identity motivates more action to some extent, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it does the opposite. It undermines motivation to act morally. And we can see that these undermining effects depend to some extent or are kind of fostered to some extent by certain more identity characteristics. That is what I want to explain. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about identity development. My general tenet is that identity develops from avoidance to approach oriented, from externally to internally motivated, and from concrete to abstract. And if I do have some time, I also want to give a quick outlet how these ideas relate to other notions of virtue and character development. All right, let me start with more identity as a goal. I already said we all have many different identity goals. We want to be a loving spouse, a productive scientist, good citizen, good child, caring parent, or fair-minded colleague, or whatever you else want to add. These are identity goals that are tied to specific roles we kind of adopt throughout our life. But there's one identity goal that is unique in a way, the more identity goal, the desire to be a more person, wanting to be a more person. This is less contingent on specific life circumstances we live in, and is less contingent on specific roles we take. It is also ubiquitous, I would say. I would claim that everyone maybe not so Tobias, but who knows? I mean, uh, everyone has this identity goal. That has to do basically with the really central role morality actually plays in person perception and person evaluation. I mean, that has been shown in social psychological work. Morality is an essential dimension on how we look at ourselves and at other people. That makes perfect sense. That this is central because morality is essential ingredient for any kind of everyday interaction we have with people. And also then more interesting kind of, or some interesting kind of twist to this argument is this literature on the true self or the true moral self that has shown that people really consider morality as a core aspect of their own person. I mean, we all admit that many things can change in our lives, but we would still consider ourselves the same person. But if our moral qualities, our moral values change, then many people think then you're a different person. It kind of disrupts your sense of identity. And that applies not only to adults, to normal adults, but it also applies to teenagers and even to children. We know that children think the same way about the true self that is truly moral. If I change my moral behaviors, I would be a different person. Now that speaks to this centrality of morality to the individual sense of self. Now, when I say moral identity goal or talk about moral identity goal, it is important to point out that this is not just one singular goal we have in mind. It's better to conceive of this goal as a goal system that involves goal hierarchies, sub-goals, and ultimate goals. Being a moral person might be related to the sub-goal of being honest, which for some people means always tell the truth and not lie to your parents, maybe for children. Being a moral person also can mean being fair and sharing equally with others. So the term moral identity goal, as I use it more in as a generic expression to kind of refer to these goal systems, not just one singular goal. Second thing, it's important that this moral identity goal is not the only motivation for moral action. Yes, it is assumed that it motivates moral action, but it is not the only motivation. Besides the motivation to do, I mean, it's besides the motivation to kind of wanting to be a moral person, we have the motivation to do what we think is right or good, or we feel spontaneous feelings of sympathy and compassion with other people, and that also motivates moral action, of course. I do think, however, that the moral identity goal is particularly important when there are when moral concerns conflict with non-moral concerns or desires, selfish desires, if you want. When we ask ourselves, so why should I be moral in this situation? Why do I want to be fair to other people, even though it runs against my own self-interest or other things? And then the question or the answer very often is, well, because I do want to be moral. I do want to be a moral person. So when it comes to these conflicts, this moral identity motivation likely helps people to prioritize moral concerns over other concerns. However, the effectiveness of moral identity motivation depends on the goal characteristics that are involved. So when you look at the goal literature, self-regulation literature in general, kind of have a look at overview chapters or articles people write, you generally see that people emphasize three major dimensions or axes how goals can differ. Goals can be approach or avoidance oriented. They can be externally or internally motivated, and they can be concrete or abstract. Approach oriented means you want to achieve a desired state, whereas avoidance oriented means you want to avoid, you want to prevent an unwanted state. This is the most basic, I think, kind of action tendencies in biological organisms. You seek pleasure and want to avoid pain. Now, when we talk about goal systems, it is helpful not to think of broad behavioral tendencies, but to think of different orientations. And here the kind of word promotion and prevention orientation comes in, because on level of goal systems or applied to goal systems, we can say approach and avoidance orientation can occur on different levels. They can occur on the level of systems, strategies, and tactics. So a common example is in health-related goals people may have. A person might have a goal to improve his or her health, and that is an approach goal, a positively defined goal. But then the strategies or tactics people use might be avoidance-oriented. You basically can try to avoid certain foods or try to avoid a certain lifestyle in order to approach your approach goal. So when we talk about goals and goal systems, I think it's better to get rid of the notion of two global action tendencies, approach and avoidance, but to talk about promotion and prevention orientations that can occur on different levels. Second thing, external versus internal motivation. It's clear external motivation is any kind of goal motivation when a goal attainment is instrumental for something else. Gaining rewards, gaining recognition or social status, we can say the goal motivation is external. When goal attainment is positive valued in itself, then we have internal motivation. Concrete versus abstract. Also clear that goals very often form hierarchies, and these hierarchies vary in the level of abstraction, right? I mean, my goal, maybe, I don't know, to graduate from high school this year is much more concrete than the goal to embark on a certain career and to gain a certain profession. Level of abstraction increases also with psychological distance, and psychological distance can actually mean three things or four things actually. It can mean temporal, spatial, social, and then there is also modality. I think that is unquestionable. Now, what I want to do next is basically apply these goal distinctions to the moral identity goal and how we can conceptualize these goal distinctions in the context of moral identity, and in what way these goal distinctions matter for, well, conceptualizing moral identity motivation, motivation for action, and finally, a few words about development. With regard to moral identity, prevention orientation and promotion orientation basically means, promotion orientation means I want to approach a certain self-ideal, a positively defined ideal. I have what it means to be a caring, kind, forgiving, generous, whatever person that defines for me a moral person. Whereas the prevention orientation basically means I want to avoid mismatches between an ideal self and a real self. I don't want to be unfair. I don't want to be dishonest, unkind, and all these things. It's well known in research on kind of goal motivation that the effectiveness of prevention or promotion orientation really depends on the regulatory fit. That means depending on the situation you are in, your goal motivation is more or less effective. Prevention orientation, I assume, fits better with what people have called constraining morality, negative duties. You don't want to, with all these kind of rules that are about you do not do certain things. You should steal, you should not lie, you should not commit in other evil acts. In this case, a prevention-oriented morality provides a strong, or a prevention-oriented moral identity motivation provides a strong motivation, whereas the promotion orientation fits better with what people have called aspirational morality. On the other hand, if someone is primarily prevention-oriented in his or her moral identity, then it is hard to motivate kind of aspirational acts, pro-social acts that are associated with morality. The importance of the promotion-prevention distinction also comes in when I talk about moral disengagement. Moral disengagement, we have just discussed this last week a little bit with Matt's talk, is basically the attempt to neutralize immoral behavior for keeping one's own moral identity intact. You can do this by denying responsibility, blaming victims, minimizing consequences, or other things. can, for instance, say, okay, a teenager might say in a store, seeing something in a store is okay because, well, other people do things that are much worse. You keep your sense of moral identity intact by neutralizing, by disengaging from your own moral behavior. Now, this works only if you have a prevention-oriented or primarily prevention-oriented moral identity. If you have a promotion-oriented moral identity, it doesn't matter whether you disengage or not, because an immoral action is always a lost opportunity to approach your self-ideal. So from a promotion-oriented perspective, moral disengagement doesn't help you much to keep your sense of moral identity intact. So moral disengagement, as is understood and studied by Bandura, somehow requires a predominantly kind of prevention-oriented moral identity motivation. That is what I would like to stress. Now, when we turn to development, it is, I think, pretty safe to say that the moral identity goal is more prevention-oriented than promotion-oriented in younger age groups. And I think of kind of middle childhood, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old children, than kind of compared to adults. We do know that children have an unrealistically positive self-view that has been called optimism bias also. They do not really differentiate between ideal and real self. It's all the same. And that includes also moral characteristics, such as being honest, being kind. Young children or kind of elementary school children think of themselves as someone who is very kind and honest in general. And children also believe that they will keep these positive characteristics over time. There's nothing they really have to do about them. Negative characteristics they might have will naturally improve. Adults don't do that necessarily. So with development, teenagers become more self-critical of their own moral capabilities, if you want, and that makes room for the idea that I can self-improve with regard to my own morality. And we can assume that moral identity goals become more promotion-oriented in the course of development. That does not, of course, imply that prevention orientation becomes completely unimportant. I think more of that prevention orientation, that is the desire not to want to be immoral or an immoral person, becomes a sub-goal of a broader aspiration to be moral. So not wanting to be unfair becomes a sub-goal of the broader aspiration to be fair. That's the general developmental trend I would present. Now, I would love to kind of give you strong empirical kind of support data for that, claims that support these ideas. Everyone who does empirical research in this group knows it's a slow process, sometimes painfully slow. Still, I want to give you some ideas, some illustration materials. I mean, how we actually approach approach these distinctions from an empirical point of view, and what so far has come out of this, to give you an idea of what kind of direction that could take from an empirical point of view. We start with what is the most commonly used kind of measure in moral identity research that has been used many times in the last 20 years, the so-called self-importance of moral identity questionnaire that was developed by Carl Quino in the early 2000s. And the approach here is that people are given various characteristics that are meant to describe a highly moral person, such as being kind, being honest, being generous, being fair. And then participants are asked, okay, now try to imagine a person who has these characteristics, and then they are asked a couple of questions that indicate how important it is for participants, for the research participants, to be this type of person. We gave this approach a slight kind of twist by differentiating between promotion and prevention orientation. We asked, very similar to what Quino and Reed do, first participants to pick 8 to 9 characteristics from a longer list that describe a highly moral person and rate how important these characteristics are for people personally. Things like caring, being courageous, being honest, loyal, respectful, and so on. So we do not work with a fixed list of attributes, but we really want to give people more freedom in choosing what they personally think are important moral characteristics for themselves. And then we do other things in the survey, and at some point in the survey, we come to a second part where we do a prevention-oriented or assess the prevention-oriented moral identity by asking people to pick 8 to 9 characteristics from a longer list that describe a highly immoral person, and then rate how important it is to avoid these characteristics such as being uncaring, cowardly, dishonest, disloyal, disrespectful, and so on. And you note in the examples I give here, we had strict matching pairs, right? I mean, so on the positive side, the promotion-oriented side, we asked, for instance, one importance of fairness, and then we always had the corresponding kind of negative attribute in this list being unfair. Now, this is based on a sample of high school and university students. Age range is between 13 and 21 years. And we found that about 31% of the attributes participants picked for defining a highly moral and a highly immoral person matched. I would say only 30%. I kind of intuitively, I would think it should be more, but I learned that. So only 30% of the pairs people chose were pairs like being fair versus being unfair, being responsible versus being irresponsible. And if we go further a little bit down and look into the correlation between the self-importance of these attributes, we find that they're only kind of moderately strong correlated at 0.55. So prevention and promotion orientation, this is what I kind of want to conclude from this, are not simply two sides of the same coin, but they diverge to some extent. Of course, they are not completely independent. That shouldn't be the case either. And more interestingly, we see a developmental trend that actually the matching pairs of moral and immoral characteristics increase with age. We find more of these matching pairs in 18 to 20-year-old participants than in younger participants. Now, a quick word about these type of charts and effects and all these things. You may ask, so how big is that effect? Does that really matter? I just want to say I only present statistically significant effects in my talk. I do not talk about effects that are not statistically significant. In terms of effect size, most of these effects are small to moderate. This here is also would be characterized as a small to moderate effect. Keep in mind, though, that the age range of this sample is pretty narrow. I mean, we start with teenagers and then with young teenagers and then have basically older teenagers. I expect, I hope, if we expand the age range under study in this type of research, then we also will get bigger age effects. Okay, next axis, next dimension, external versus internal motivation applied to moral identity. And when we apply this distinction to moral identity, I think it's obvious. People want to be a moral person, maybe basically to gain recognition from others, to leave a good impression on others. And this is an external motivation. People may also want to be a moral person because they want to be consistent with what they think is important, what really matters in their life. And then we have an example for internal motivation. Generally speaking, internally motivated goals are more effective in motivating action. As a general kind of rule, we can say this. That shows in many different parts of psychological research. Of course, internally motivated goals do depend less on external contingencies, by definition almost, and internally motivated goals are more self-sustaining and less easily depleted. You don't give up that quickly if you have an internal motivation as compared to someone who's externally motivated. Internal motivation, the distinction between internal and external motivation also is important for what others have described as more hypocrisy than Batson. very kind of strong in his claims, basically saying the basic type of moral motivation people have is a hypocritical motivation. They want to appear moral while actually trying to avoid the costs of being moral. This is the generic type of motivation, according to Dan Batson. I would say, yes, if you only look at external identity motivation, that is true, but an extreme external motivation where there is no internal motivation involved is not the general case. It is an exception of the rule, as I can also show you a little bit later. So moral hypocrisy is one specific configuration of moral identity motivation, where you see high scores, extremely high scores maybe, of an external motivation that is not matched by any internal moral identity motivation. When it comes to development, we do have evidence and good reasons to assume that an external motivation, moral identity motivation, tends to decrease over the course of development, while internal motivation increases. This is consistent with various kind of developmental models. And it does, again, not imply that external motivation becomes completely unimportant with age. And also, I would like to add here at this point, it does not imply that children are completely externally motivated from a moral point of view. I mean, we do know from research that was done in the self-determination theory context that children have some sort of intrinsic moral motivation, but that does not necessarily appear on the level of their moral identity. Their moral identity, the desire to be a moral child, a moral person, is more externally motivated, I would say, than internally motivated. We do see changes towards an increased internal motivation. Here's an example from an interview study I did based on interview data, where we see the most pronounced change to be happen between, well, adolescence and early adulthood, and then changes were actually leveling off. I then want to kind of add a little bit more empirical material here and show you, continue with my illustration I gave you. How do we actually assess this external versus internal motivation in a more standardized approach? I already showed you the tweak, the modification we did with regard to the self-importance of moral identity questionnaire. We added to that when we actually asked people to pick 8 to 9 characteristics that define a highly moral person. We continue asking them, so why are these important characteristics for you? And here we distinguish between an external and an internal motivation. External is something like, I want to leave a good impression on others, or I don't want to leave a bad impression on others, or I want to think others, I want others to think of me as a good person. Internal motivation is something like, these characteristics are part of who I am, or this is the way I like to be. For a promotion-oriented moral identity, for a prevention-oriented, it would be, this is not the way I like to be. And we can kind of form 4 scales that reflect external, internal motivation in the context of this prevention and promotion-oriented morality. They can nicely form a factorial structure, if you want. I don't go into details here, so we can nicely kind of distinguish these aspects. And more interestingly, these 4 aspects also systematically related to decision-making, at least in hypothetical scenarios, and forecasted, anticipated emotions in the context of moral behavior. Here are 2 examples from 2 different types of scenarios I used. We present participants with short scenarios where they have the option to engage in a pro-social action or not, where they have the option to engage in an antisocial action or not. And it's always a moral concern that is pit against self-interest to some extent. One example would be, for instance, a teenager finds expensive headset in the shopping mall. Someone actually has dropped it there, left it there. It's brand new. It just bought it in the store nearby, and someone forgot to kind of take it with him or her. Now, what do? Do you want to keep that headset for yourself because it's really nice, or do you want to return that headset to the store and yeah, basically hope that the person will be able to pick it up there? Or for the antisocial context, it's a cheating scenario. You have the opportunity to ace an exam because you have access to previous versions of the exam. So do you want to do this or not? In all of these situations, there are no reputational costs involved. That is important to understand the findings. We do see that internal motivation positively predicts the decision to engage in prosocial action, whereas it negatively predicts the decision to engage in antisocial action. That should be the case. At the same time, the external motivation, especially the prevention-oriented external motivation, negatively predicts prosocial action and positively predicts the decision to engage in antisocial action. And so if you have a predominantly externally motivated, prevention-oriented moral identity, saying, I don't want to leave a bad impression on other people, then there is no point to engage in a pro-social action that does not give you any reputational gains if you want. And as a consequence, you go with a self-interested alternative group of people here. There are similar interesting kind of differential relationships between these types of moral identity motivation and feelings, small emotions. Teenagers and young adults anticipate, forecast in these scenarios. I just want to give you one example here, go further that relates to pride. Positive feelings you experience for engaging in moral behavior, for being pro-social or resisting the temptation to engage in antisocial behavior. We distinguish between two types of pride here. One we call authentic, the other one we call hubristic. Authentic pride is just a positive emotion that is related to being able to do something good, what you think was right, helping other people, looking at the positive consequences it has for other people. And you see that this type of moral identity motivation is positively related with authentic pride, while it's negatively related to hubristic pride. Hubristic pride is basically a sort of a self-inflated view, generalized view of what a good person you are. And this hubristic pride is positively related to external identity motivation. So we do see systematic differential relationships between these various types of motivation, decision-making, and emotions teenagers and young adults anticipate. One more word about development. Based on this kind of more standardized approach where we use kind of scales, we also see that internal moral identity motivation slightly increases over these 6-year or 5-year time interval, versus external motivation slightly decreases. So overall, the difference between internal and external motivation increases with age, which is consistent with the idea that internal motivation, moral identity motivation, becomes more important as teenagers and adults mature. Okay, one more aspect I would like to discuss, namely the distinction between concrete versus abstract goals applied to moral identity again. The moral identity goal, the desire to be a moral person, can be very concrete and very specific, tied to specific action in specific circumstances. Wanting to be helpful to friends, wanting to keep the promises to your spouse, or not lying to your parents. These are very concrete goals people may have, and I suppose especially children have. But they also can be very abstract in terms of general commitments to general values such as honesty, kindness, fairness. And we do know from other research outside the moral domain that abstract goals allow individuals to better counter lower level temptations and prioritize long-term goals over short-term gains. The standard example here is that also has been studied quite well empirically is health-related behavior, dieting. If people are on diet and then they kind of are tempted to consume food they actually would not want to do, reminding them of the long-term health-related goals, which are long-term and more abstract, helps them to counter these temptation that are related to kind of short-term goals, short-term gains. We do also see similar things in the mall domain. One example, one study I like to cite here is where different instructions were given to university students. One instruction not to be a cheater, and the other instruction not to cheat in an exam. Not to be a cheater is more abstract, and it actually relates to your identity, whereas not to cheat is more concrete. It is an action to describe. And we do see that simply giving students the instruction not to be a cheater is more effective in reducing the amount of cheating we see. Also, this distinction between concrete and abstract is important for what has been discussed as moral licensing. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with that concept. It's basically the idea that remembering good deeds from your own past basically gives you an excuse for your current or future misbehavior. This effect can be demonstrated kind of in experiments reliably. And it is present, however, only when you memorize past behavior as concrete behavior. When the past behavior reminds you of the importance of abstract values, the licensing effect actually disappears. So we can say if people have abstract moral identity goals, they are probably less prone to this effect of moral licensing. With regard to development, it is, I think, self-evident almost that we can assume that there is a developmental trend from concrete to abstract. Young children understand themselves very much in behavioral terms as someone who likes to help others, as someone who shares with others. Later on, they construct cognitive representations of these behavioral tendencies in terms of traits. They say, I'm someone who's helpful, who's kind or fair. And adolescents then start to form systems of these representational systems by saying, I'm someone who values kindness, for instance, particularly. And that means I'm someone who prioritizes being kind of other concerns in given situations. Far more abstract kind of representation of what it means to be a moral person. Again, this does not simply mean that concrete identity goals become unimportant. That shouldn't be, but they become more type of a sub-goal in a system of higher level abstractions. So you have more abstract, more identity goals. At the same time, these more abstract goals are tied to some extent to more concrete goals. Whereas children, even in middle to late childhood, actually lack this level of abstraction, of abstractness. Again, an illustration how we kind of approach that from an empirical point of view, starting again from this self-importance of moral identity questionnaire, we ask participants to pick descriptors of a highly moral or immoral person, but then we also give them choices between concrete and abstract terms. For instance, for the moral person, an abstract characterization is being caring or is being honest. That whereas a concrete description is someone who helps others or someone who does not tell lies. And we kind of intermingle these concrete and abstract terms equally, and we simply let people choose whether they want to take an abstract or concrete description of a highly moral person or of a highly immoral person. And in the sample of high school and university students, 600 students approximately, we do see that there's a wide range in the number of abstract or concrete choices. We see that here you see that actually the number of abstract choices. I mean, some research participants choose almost 100% abstract terms. for describing their own moral identity. Others choose almost 100% concrete terms. Now, on average, 56% of abstract choices are for the immoral prototype, the immoral person, and 61 of choices are for the moral person are abstract. So there is a tendency that abstract choices are more often taken when people envision a highly moral person in contradistinction to a highly immoral person. That, well, is somehow consistent with the idea that abstract moral identity goals tend to be more motivating because they are more promotion oriented. The general idea I already kind of mentioned. And that also shows to some extent in our kind of age-related analysis. We do find that abstract moral identity terms typically go together with a stronger moral identity than concrete terms with age. So for teenagers, younger teenagers, it doesn't really make much of a difference whether they choose abstract or concrete terms. But for 18 to 20 years old, when they choose abstract terms for describing their own moral identity, these terms are also more strongly endorsed as something that is important to me. Okay, that was it, basically. I should come to an end. So quick summary, and maybe then one final outlook. First, I want to say that moral identity can be conceptualized as a goal, or as a goal system, I should better say. And now this goal system is ubiquitous, maybe even universal, but it carries different goal characteristics. And I pointed out 3 different axes: prevention orientation, external motivation, or concrete, versus, promotion orientation, internally motivated, and abstract. It's, of course, a totally different discussion how these 3 dimensions relate to each other. I didn't talk much about this, and then maybe that's something we can talk about more in the discussion. Now, moral identity is more prevention-oriented, externally motivated, and concrete at younger ages. And with development, it becomes more promotion-oriented, internally motivated, and abstract. This change is probably most marked in adolescence and early adulthood, but certainly not limited to this age period. I really would like to stress that I think these dimensions sort of give us a lifespan, potentially give us a lifespan account of how moral identity could develop over a long period of time in adulthood too. Now, promotion-oriented, internally motivated, and abstract moral identity is more effective in motivating more action, I would say, and this becomes particularly evident and obvious when we talk about these undermining effects I have kind of picked, namely more disengagement, more hypocrisy, and more licensing. Certain goal characteristics in moral identity actually prevent these undermining effects from taking in. Okay, one final slide. As I promised at the beginning, a short outlook. What is this all good for? Yes, very short. Where does this lead us? Where could this lead us? It's clear that the ability to adequately respond to moral demand characteristics of a given situation is an acquired skill. It's something we build over time, over a lifetime, maybe. And philosophers very much emphasize the cognitive aspect of this process, of this competence. The idea of practical wisdom, phronesis, comes in here. But they tend to neglect, I would say, the motivational prerequisites. What motivates individuals to develop virtues over a lifetime? And yeah, there's, of course, this idea of happiness, flourishing, eudaimonia. But I would say it is important to distinguish between the motivation to self-improve and the outcome. I would be skeptical, highly skeptical, to say that people are motivated to self-improve with regard to morality because it makes them happier, or because they increase the flourishing. Now, moral identity motivation provides, or moral identity provides a motivation for virtue development if it is promotion-oriented and internally motivated and abstract. The promotion orientation gives people a goal for self-improvement. The internal motivation makes sure that this motivation is sustained over a longer period of times, not easily depleted, not contingent on external circumstances. And the level of reflection makes sure that we apply this motivation to new situations, to new circumstances that actually occur necessarily as we grow older. So moral identity conceptualized as a specific form of goal motivation fills a void in virtue theories. That's what I would like to claim at the end. Okay, that's my end. Thank you for listening. Just want to say, I also want to thank all my students, former students and present students who's one way or the other helped to develop these ideas and to help to kind of collect data. And I want to thank them as you have been listening to this. Okay.
Thank you very much, Tobias. That was a wonderful talk. It's really helps to fill in this idea of moral identity in a huge way. I've got a zillion questions for you, but I'm going to defer to the group. And I think you brought us to a really nice close, tying in some previous presentations as well. So let's take some questions and comments for Tobias. And we'll start with Veronica and go to Randy.
Thank you so much for your talk. Really, I took a lot of notes, very, very stimulating. Your title, when I read your title, you know, when Blaine first circulated the titles of the talks, it was music to my ears because of the perspective of conceptualizing this as goal motivation. And so I wanted to, if you don't mind, I'd like to sort of, you know, you've talked about a lot of research findings, but I'd like to go right back to the basics or the core underlying assumption, the assumption that studying moral identity as a goal motivation is valuable. And the reason why I find this so important is I struggled with this myself, right? You go back to, like, I study eudaimonia, you go back to Aristotle's writings, and it's all about sort of what you've achieved, like almost like an external objective checklist of, you know, have you achieved these milestones in life? Or some people might define it as a checklist of behaviors, or perhaps even as a subjective feeling. What I've always done is I've defined it as a goal motivation, exactly as what you're talking about. And I have my reasons for doing so, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about sort of your reasons for thinking that perhaps it's not the only way to study moral identity. Certainly these other sort of approaches also add information, but why would this be such a key way of trying to get at moral identity?
I mean, in my view, because in the end, when we study moral identity, we are interested in the subjective view people take on their own moral actions, on themselves as a moral person, and on their kind of moral aspirations they have in the long term, right? It's not just moral identity as a predictor of the next action in the next 5 minutes. But when we talk about moral identity, we automatically have this sort of long time perspective, because we assume moral identity is something that stays with me for the rest of my life. And so we want to, I think, include these kind of subjective view, this subjective experience of what it means to have a moral identity and why the moral identity matters to you. And I think this is something that is well captured in this conceptualization of moral identity as a goal. And that's a little bit different from conceptualizing moral identity as a trait or conceptualizing moral identity as a narrative. Because I think from a trait perspective, we still approach the moral identity concept from a kind of more external perspective and an external view. And from the narrative perspective, now kind of maybe Jack can correct me here, it is harder to kind of include the prospective aspects of moral identity. I mean, narratives are necessarily always looking back. We try to kind of integrate our past experiences to kind of coherent sense of self. But moral identity does have this prospective function, this that we make choices, we make maybe life-important decisions, life-changing decisions that choose certain directions in our life, and the moral identity matters here. And that is something that comes out best with this taking this goal perspective. So I think there are various things that come together where we can say, yes, it makes sense, it is helpful to conceptualize moral identity as a goal system. And as I said, it is not the same as defining it. I mean, it can give you a verbal definition and say, yes, okay, working definition, subjective sense of morality, importance of morality. But the crucial question is, where do we want to put this moral identity concept from a psychological point of view? What is it from a psychological point of view, a good way of conceptualizing it? And I think obviously we are in the same boat. Goal motivation is something that seems to be very helpful. Yeah. I don't know, is that?
That's great, thank you.
Great, yeah, thanks.
Go ahead, Randy.
That's a wonderful talk, Tobias. I really enjoyed it and rang certain bells with the connections to your previous work. So I guess and let me just say as a comment first, I think focusing on a goal motivation is right on. I started arguing around 2013, right, that if you were thinking about the formation of a virtue as a dispositional state to act well and so on, then what you would want to try to encourage in children would be exactly this goal to be a good person. That focusing on more concrete things would have limitations of the kinds that you've identified. So it seems to me from a developmental standpoint, if you don't have the aspiration to be a good person, then the formation, right, the moral formation is going to be impaired, and it's going to be harder to figure out, how to get children ready to deal with novel situations and to find a room for judgment in figuring out what they specifically should be doing, right, given that the goal is sort of to be a good person. And I completely agree with what you said about the end, about the eudaimonistic orientation that seems to me not helpful from the point of view of thinking about motivation. But here's the question. Do you have a view about the relationship between moral motivation and identity motivation? You mean they can't be this? They can't be identical.
Of course.
Given some of
I said this
said.
quickly at the beginning, right? That motivation, or kind of to better distinguish it, we should kind of more motivation to act morally. That is not necessarily the same, right? And the motivation to engage in more action and the motivation to act morally. Now, as I said, I see moral identity motivation as an additional layer that helps us to prioritize morality over other concerns, many other concerns children have, and also teenagers have, and adults have. We do not just have this one goal of being a moral person. We do have many other goals, and very often these goals conflict to some extent, and they do not necessarily harmonize. And then to have this moral identity goal that maybe is really that takes priority over other identity goals that are considered more important than other goals, that helps us to make this kind of to prioritize more concerns or more actions over immoral actions in these very everyday mundane situations. That is the general idea. That does not necessarily mean that we act in the very specific situation, or that the child in this very specific situation acts out of the desire to be a moral person. The desire might be still, I want to help my friend, or I want to do things that I think are good and right. But in the process of making a decision, what do I want now here? Maybe very quickly, the desire to be a moral person helps us to prioritize moral concerns over non-moral concerns, especially in situations where they conflict. This is where I think moral identity becomes really relevant.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we have a question or comment from Kate, then we'll go on to Matt.
Thank you, Tobias. That was a really, really enriching and interesting talk. I really appreciated it. I have just a couple of sort of more specific questions about your research, about your study, and then a broader kind of speculative question. So you presented data for 13 and 14, and then was it 18 to 21 year olds? Did you actually have data for 15 through 17 with respect to those variables?
Not now. I mean,
okay.
We are currently in the process of collecting more data, also with older age groups, 35 and up.
Okay.
And certainly it would be also important to have a middle age group, 15 to 17.
Along
so
that way, yeah. That's
actually see whether this is actually a trend, an age-related trend, and not just something else. I mean, there's always a certain risk.
Yeah.
In presenting cross-sectional data this way, I totally admit that. But the plan is to expand on that, and then
okay, that's great. Yeah, and fair enough. We often start at cross-sectional data, so that's fine. And I just had a question about your effect sizes then, and would you expect them to change if you were doing, looking at more of a general kind of, probably linear or at least, monotonic increasing kind of function? What do you expect?
I mean,
what did you get, and what do you expect?
That would be the idea. If I increase the age range, especially if I increase the age range, go further up in age and down. I mean, I think this kind of approach, empirical approach, is perfectly suitable for even 7 to 8 year old children. You could use that. Then, of course, I expect that the overall effect of, in terms of effect size of age, should increase. Now, we could start a discussion at this point. So do we really have to look so much at effect sizes when we do this type of research? There's no intervention involved here. There's no treatment involved.
Yeah.
So what does an effect size actually mean? Yeah. But that's another thing. Yeah. But I would expect that the effect of age should increase. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's great that you frame it that way, because effect sizes don't always, they're not always sort of pragmatically meaningful. I wonder if, just from my own kind of, musings about aging and morality, if you might get something that, sort of gets not exponential, but moving in that direction, because I think often as we do approach middle age and then advanced age, these questions of moral identity they weigh on us, I think, very heavily, and for completely reasonable reasons they don't as much at younger ages. The horizon is shorter, I think, often. Yeah. Would that be something you expect?
Absolutely. I mean, I did one study. There's one study where we really captured a broad age range from 12 to 65 and older.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
That is some time ago, and we didn't really particularly kind of look into these various aspects. I mean, I was talking about today. That's why I did not really draw from this study much. But I totally agree. We see the process of moral identity development is really ongoing in adulthood. It is not that we can, I mean, this is the general kind of preconception that, well, it's adolescence and adulthood, early adulthood. There might be some reasons to that, because we see, significant change there, but it continues thereafter. It's not that it stops, say, at 25 or 30. No, it continues to show changes. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. And if you'll just indulge me one further question, and it, certainly it's just maybe something to think about, not necessarily answer. But you mentioned that moral identity can be studied from a trait perspective or more of a narrative perspective. And I'm just wondering what space there is currently, or maybe for other approaches, which are not mutually exclusive with either the kind of more empirical trait or narrative, but for conceptual analytic work. And I'm thinking of, Peter Hacker, who's, in his tetralogy has come out with the moral powers, and that is a conceptual analytic work that from which you might be able to draw something about, moral identity and motivation. Or Georgia Warrenke's work, she talks about moral identity, or about not moral identity, but identity as being, very kind of almost gestalt in its ontology. We come in and out of different identities, and with respect to different roles we're playing, different contexts and situations. And I just wonder if you've sought any, kind of knowledge in that domain, or if there is much room made for it.
I think currently, I agree with you, there's a lot of interest in identity and morality, the connection between morality and identity. I mean, the approach psychology typically takes is looking, okay, what can identity do to morality? In what way can we improve our understanding of moral functioning when we include these identity notions and conceptions? And so that's the psychologist's kind of bias, if you want to put it this way. But of course, I can reverse the way to look at moral identity and can ask also, what does morality do to people's identity? In what way is it helpful or important, maybe even necessary, kind of to construct your sense of identity and kind of keep it over time and all these things? And that is a completely different way of looking at moral identity. It is not necessarily kind of in the primary, or not, doesn't have, it hasn't been the primary interest how psychologists actually approach moral identity, but I'm fascinated by that perspective too. And I think there's much more to say about this when we ask ourselves, so why actually do people take morality as such a core piece for constructing their own moral identity, They often, and this is something I think there's much more kind of we can think about and imagine to talk about.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Matt, you had a question or comment?
Thank you, Tobias. We're like-minded on so many things here, as you know, we've discussed. I guess I'll just ask a question I've always sort of been curious about. I have very little grip on the sort of psychological development literature in terms of moral development. And so I'm always sort of wondering, on the one hand, you think it's nice to see these trends where in terms of moral identity, you see, more promotion, as more of a focus on promotion as kids grow older, and internalization, and more abstract identity, and obviously our own moral identities are getting more complex as we're experiencing the world and developing cognitively and so forth. But insofar as all those are sort of on the upward trend, it makes me think, oh, well, good, if that's all linked to better behavior, we ought to just see a nice upward trajectory in moral behavior. But I don't think it tracks that. Insert your own level of cynicism here. So I'm wondering just how to make sense of those two things, where I feel like, if those trends are increasing, and in ways in which we do think that they're associated with, more moral behavior and so forth, why does not seem like we're going to just see that in actual lived behavior? So
yeah, thank you. That, I think, very important questions, and raises of course the question a little bit. So what do we do as developmental psychologists when we actually point out developmental trends? In my view, it's first of all, and that is not something we can do only by looking at empirical data when we, as developmental psychologists, want to kind of identify developmental trends. As everyone knows, development is not just a descriptive concept. It has normative, evaluative kind of undercurrents or underpinnings, if you want. And you cannot just say, okay, have a look at the data and tell me what development looks like. I need to have a sort of a preconception what I want to look at. And I understand these kind of dimensions I describe as this sort of groundwork where we can say, okay, it makes sense. It is also empirically kind of valid to think of moral identity development in these terms. Now, very common misconception is that when I say it promotes, it becomes more promotion-oriented, abstract, and internally motivated. This is not an absolute endpoint, but we think everyone at some point will end up with a completely abstract and internally motivated and promotion-oriented moral identity. It's more sort of the direction. If there is systematic change, this is direction where development goes. And I'm pretty sure there are many people out there whose moral identity is primarily prevention-oriented, externally motivated, maybe even concrete, even in adulthood. So it's not an automatic kind of mechanism that pulls people forward, pushes them forward into these kind of areas. So it has a lot to do with kind of what conditions do we actually encounter in childhood and adolescence that kind of promote certain developmental trends. That's the first thing. And still then, it's not an automatic kind of granted process. And there's a lot of variability too, right? I mean, it does not mean that all people kind of automatically move up the ladder, if you want, but there is also a substantial proportion of people who never really change much. And it could even better, could even worse, that at some point there is regressive development. That is also possible. So basically, when I say the developmental trend is towards abstract, promotion-oriented, internally motivated identity, it does not exclude the possibility that some people at some point in development, even in adulthood, show opposite trends. I mean, and I become more cynical about everything, about themselves too. And yeah, the more identity becomes, well, should I say, I mean, deflated version of what it has been in the past. Yeah. It's not excluded, it's possible. I think we have to be very, very careful when we talk about development well, on the one hand, I mean, to separate a little bit the conceptual part from the empirical part. And as said, describing development is not simply an empirical endeavor where you look at the data and say, here we see it, but it always implies some sort of conceptual ideas where you could kind of actually say, yes, it makes sense to consider this an important developmental dimension. And I think the sense comes from what I described at the end. If we are generally interested in self-improvement, what kind of identity, moral identity should people have in order to be able to learn through experience in a constructive way, then we should look at a promotion-oriented kind of abstract and internally motivated moral identity.
Good. Yeah, no, that helps frame the developmental to sort of like, this is the starting point, and if you're going to see a direction change, it's going to be in this way. My further thought is that some of those positive trends could be in other respects counterbalanced by people becoming, say, more sophisticated and more in moral disengagement, because so much of disengagement is basically utilizing
of a backstory here. I could quickly tell. I didn't talk much about about this in my presentation because it was sort of too much then. There right now is a very influential group of people in developmental psychology, and they do really interesting work who would study moral identity, they say, in 5-year-olds. And what they typically do, very simple experiments, take, for instance, let's say, for instance, sharing. You share with someone else. You engage in a collaborative task, and then at some point you have to engage, share the spoils of what you did. And they let children do this only in dyads or while there's a third-party observer. Just another child watching them kind of sharing things. And what you do see that if there's a third-party observer, another child who's not necessarily part of the group or part of the classroom or whatever, if these children are watched by other observers, they share more, they cheat less, they steal less, and all these things. And they basically say, yes, we do have evidence for a moral identity in these young children because they want to demonstrate certain moral qualities to other people and to their peers, actually, basically. And here, so my kind of struggle is also a little bit, how can I connect this idea of moral identity, and which is empirically demonstrable in young children, with other notions of moral identity we are more used to, right? I mean, this measures, I mean, values that really matter to you, to what extent do they matter to you? And it's a little bit a way of trying to connect two different ideas about moral identity that exists in the developmental literature, and where we can clearly see, yes, 5-year-olds actually are concerned about how they present themselves,
at least viewed,
moral qualities to others, and that is an effective thing. Yeah.
Okay, let's give our local narrativist a moment to talk with Tobias.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it to a moment, but it's so hard to, because Tobias is, I mean, like everybody's saying, this like touches on everything I think we all do, and we're all like nodding our heads. Yes, motivation, it's wonderful. I mean, and it's what I study in narratives is the most interesting thing is motivation, that those are the themes, and that's where you see all the moral qualities come out, all the different categories that we have, moral, all these kinds of things. And even in goals, when you have narratives of goals, you see the same thing. That was some of my earliest research was on goals and goal hierarchies, like you're saying this. So what you're saying is just very, very exciting to me. And on a personal note, we've never talked personally, but I just want to thank you that you have inspired, in my daughter, who's in high school, did a paper on moral identity. Just by chance, she texted me one day from class, and how that happened, I don't know. But in any case, she's like, Dad, is there any research on people who want to do the right thing and then what they actually do? I'm like, yeah, there's a ton. So she goes out and searches all these, your work was a big part of her paper and has sparked all this interest in all these great dinner conversations. So this is very personal for me. So thank you very much. Okay. So then,
thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm so glad to hear these things, because, well, you study and you write things, you never really know whether it reaches people, but then once in a while you get this sort of feedback, and that is really great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good. Two main, actually, to follow up on Matt's idea, the idea of and the research that you were talking about on the 5-year-olds forming these and trying to figure out how could that fit into a moral goal framework. I wonder, so like identity at that age is like so social, it's so groupish, it's so, identifying with the group. And I'm thinking, okay, what do? You got social identity theory or something like that could help. But I'm like, I'm not sure that when I think of goals, something the work on the norm of group interest as a social identity kind of thing, but it's not a social identity thing. It's opposed to that it's like you have a connection to others through the shared goals that you have. So it's like a norm of this group interest. And I wonder if that might be like if anyone's done work on that or something like that, is like a stepping stone to this goal hierarchy where you have the abstract idea of the moral identity tied to particular goals would be a kind of an interesting thing. Those are just some random thoughts. But
I totally agree with you that generally the identity concept has two different kind of historical theoretical roots, right? The one is the social identity literature, where the notion of identity is necessarily tied to group membership, but it's also tied to group membership in opposition or in kind of difference to other groups, right? It's always this aspect, I'm part of a group, and then there are other groups out there and I'm not part of their group. So, and then there's the other notion of identity, which is Ericksonian in the broadest sense of the word that, I mean, this idea of ego identity, coherence, consistency, you somehow achieve in your own kind of self. Yeah. And for moral identity, it is interesting that actually, we can benefit from taking both roots into account. And people very much looked into moral identity only from this Ericksonian view as something that creates or allows people to be consistent, have this sense of self-coherence and unity. But at the same time, moral identity is also part of your social identity. And now the only problem I have with that, the social identity literature, as in social psychology, we see it as does not allow us to study social identity in a group that is sort of unlimited. And social identity is always, I'm part of this group and other people are a part of another group. And then with morality, that does not necessarily work. So because morality is expansive in itself. And that's the only thing. But a little bit what I kind of want to point at is that, yes, the moral identity, if you want, of children is primarily a social identity. It functions as a social identity. I want to be part of a community of people. I want to be a respected member of this moral community. It might be small, it might be my classroom, it might be my family. I want to be a member of this community. And then you grow out of that and develop more abstract, more internally motivated kind of notions of your own moral identity. But that's just basically what I want to say.
Yeah, that. I mean, that actually is very much in line with what I think I was like saying too quickly. Is that this the norm of group interest, which is kind of like in opposition to the social identity thing, where there has to be this contrast group, is something that I see happening there, and it kind of is it. I had not thought of that literature in terms of morality or in terms of identity as I study it, and I think you study it in a similar kind of way. The main questions I had two sets of questions, which we don't have time to, but just to think about was one: can these abstract moral identity goals become, what happens when they become overbearing? As in, just like an overactive moral identity kind of thing, where it's like crippling for people. I'm always interested in that kind of thing. And then another thing, and it is a little bit tied to that, and is the idea of the concrete, the abstract, the avoidance approach, the extrinsic, the intrinsic. I know you were just able to give a broad view of these things and how they're working. And there's this like, the approach, intrinsic and abstract is the thing that's kind of helping us be more moral than it would be otherwise, in a stronger way than the other track is. The other flip side of those motivations are. But is there some kind of balance between them? I'm always on this like intrinsic and internal versus external motivation. Intrinsic motivation will sustain our attention. We'll be doing things we love, and we're usually be more humanistic in these kinds of concerns. Yet on the other hand, something about extrinsic motivation is helpful in bringing out the developing the skills that we would need to actually do those things even better. And it could be so I wonder what your thoughts are on, I don't know, any of these things that might relate. So, yeah.
Let me just interject here. We've come to the end of our scheduled time. There's no reason we can't continue. There's plenty of interest, and we may not want to let go of this kind of intellectual conversation we've been having this month. So I don't want to foreclose it prematurely, but I also want to just let people know that if you need to be on to other things, that's perfectly within our shared understanding. And I also want to just thank all of the presenters for the fabulous work you did. And I feel very intellectually nurtured this month with running from talking about the narratives of morality to practical wisdom, to how we deal with our fallibility as human beings, to what moral identity might mean from a goal perspective. These are all wonderful topics, and it's brought out so much shared interest and shared common ground that I think is fabulous. And then we have some ways that we differ and some interesting questions to still keep pursuing. But thank you so much for all of this. And then those who want to stay can continue, and we'll end when we decide we're done.
Thank you so much, Blaine, for putting all this together.
Yes, I want to thank
Yes,
too. Yeah, it's really great. It's such a great opportunity to really share ideas with people I know who are really interested in kind of these ideas and developing further, not so much in the end product, but also in kind of developing these ideas further. And that is really great. Yeah.
Well, you're very welcome. It's one of those things where I think my self-interest and our shared interest overlap.
That's it.
It's a labor of love, and I'm happy for all of us, to be together.
Yeah.
It's been the highlight of my week for the past month, and I confess that I'm a little bit sad that it's coming to an end, and I'm really, really hoping that we can do this again next year.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks, Blaine. And I'm trying to get back and watch the recordings of the ones I couldn't be here for live. I'm, as much as I'm dying to be pouring sweat, staining my deck, I want to stay for a couple more minutes. Tobias, did you want to respond to Jack? I just had a couple thoughts.
This is certainly something, Jack, there's much more room for development, right? For conceptual development, not empirical development. I wanted to stress a couple of times in my talk that we should, when I say, for instance, okay, there is an increase in internal motivation or an increase in abstractness, that does not necessarily mean that the other pole, the concreteness kind of disappears. No, it has to be part of the goal system. I said more identity as a goal system. And I said an aspirational and promotion-oriented more identity goal takes the lead, is a guide, sort of a prevention-oriented more identity, right? So a prevention-oriented more identity has to be integrated to some extent into a promotion-oriented more identity. It would not make sense to think of these as two separate entities, and the one basically takes off and the other one is sort of neglected. Same with external and internal motivation. I agree with you that external motivation can be an important trigger, for instance. It can just trigger an internal process. I mean, people feel themselves, they see in a situation, oh, I might be evaluated, but then this kind of triggers other more internal processes. And it would be totally wrong to think of the one as the bad thing and the other thing as a good thing. But these things work together. These different types of motivation work together. And I would not say the one should completely dominate the other and we can forget about the other. Yeah, and then, I mean, I just throw this in. I mean, there's the Aristotelian kind of idea of hitting the mean balance might be really important here. In overall, right? I mean, you think of abstract and concrete. It's of course, if you only have abstract ideals, but you don't know how to put them in practice, what's the point? I mean, you certainly have a certain level of concreteness also in your more identity goals. Otherwise, you will kind of not implement them in your life. So yeah, there's certainly more to think about here. Yeah.
If I could just add into that, yes, it seems to be like I've actually been trying to figure out how exactly to sort of fit construal theory into my picture. But I mean, it's sort of like when you have these abstract goals, as you said, it's hard to act on them. And so you need the more approximate sub goals let's talk about last time to be actionable. But it comes with a trade-off, namely in the moment, you're more focused on these narrow one-off interactions and so forth. And sometimes you might need to be reminded of the greater purposes they serve if you might be torn to do something else in that, and so like that's, you get sometimes it makes sense to climb back up the ladder and remind yourself, especially if you're, again, sort of being conflicted between short-term goals that are more easy or pleasurable or something like that. So,
I mean, this is what some people and the goal kind of literature, not related to more like morality or more identity, stress a lot is the flexibility with which you can kind of switch also. You can switch on a higher level or a lower level, and you can basically flexibly kind of adjust to what is going on. And now, I mean, from a developmental point of view, it's a little bit different. All what I want to say basically, if you lack this ability to go abstract, to go higher in your goal hierarchies, and to see the whole thing, situation or your actions from this very distant abstract perspective, then you're missing an essential quality for instance, kind of self-improvement over time for virtue development.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
I'll just following up on what Tobias and Matt just said. There's an interesting body of work now about environmental action, sustainability, environmental action within the SDT paradigm, and a number of studies where you see getting people to where they're valuing or they have the right abstract goal, but it really helps enormously to sort of, if you have interventions, to sort of both get them motivated at that abstract level, like caring about, the environment or caring about, the survival of the species or whatever, to then get them to the more concrete action plan. It's a much higher impact on what people actually do. And the general problem in a lot of these things is if it's just amorphous, people can easily just feel helpless, right? And not know. And so, moving them towards something concrete that's a really important additional step. I just wanted to, going back to something you said, Jack, with group identities, how that interacts with morality depends a lot on what the norms are of the group that you identify yourself as part of. If you're identified as part of group X, and group X dehumanizes, members of group Y, then that's going to be very different, right? So there is, you may know more of this research than I do, but I just thought it worth mentioning.
Yeah, no, that's a question that comes up, like, I think through all these things. So with, to have a moral identity, well, if I'm thinking that a moral identity is that, is not exactly humane, is to use just a single word, or pro-social or something like that. But or if I'm even using the script that these are my values, and I'm not just spitting them out, but I'm spitting that out then as a script. But I would think that, like, in large enough studies, like you've got, Tobias, that kind of evens out, and that at least at this point in history, with what these words mean, that it works in the way that we would think of them to work, in a kind of pro-social way. But yeah.
So it's a great body of experimental work with very young children, right? Where you can see the moderating effects of the group identities, a sort of spontaneously just conduct, right? So 5 and 6 year olds, you have a distribution that's unequal across some form of difference, and where they'll perceive that form of difference, like gender, as morally irrelevant, and then you let them, you give them things they can distribute at will, and they'll engage in this compensatory distribution to try to rebalance the injustice, and with a lot of, shocking perceptiveness about what forms of difference are morally significant and which aren't, right? And then the sort of rounds where you're introducing, group identities of different kinds. So my colleague Laura Ellenboss has been doing research along those lines for a few years now. It's quite interesting. Anyway.
Thanks.
Just the literature you mentioned about the environmental action is interesting, both for the being able to say, look, things are of course more effective when you couple goal intentions with implementation intentions. How are you going to actually act on this? In one way, I think that's important for moral goals, because a lot of times there's the trap of thinking, oh yeah, I'm an honest person already, so there's nothing I need to do to sort of follow up on it. But you might think with, especially with the environmental literature, so long as you're trying to get people on board with the goal of sustainability, but then it seems like a very difficult goal to achieve. You know, again, taking on board a goal means you've got now a discrepancy and you're going to be receiving, you know, negative affect so long as you're not seeming like you're making any progress or taking anything. So like there's the danger of just getting stuck with getting somebody to have this goal and then feeling overwhelmed and not sure what to do. And okay, now I'm just sitting with negative affect and I can't get rid of it. Disengage. That sort of thing, because
Tobias, your work with autobiographical reasoning would deal with a lot of that you know, linking the broad characteristics to the actions at hand and wrestling through and reflectively taking different perspectives to make sense of it is something. The thing that always amazes me is that it inherently has a moral quality to it. That it's you know, we treat it as just a pure like epistemological kind of meaning making process, but it's just the morality, you just can't escape it. It's there, you know. So, any case.
One of the things that I like about the way you presented this, Tobias, speaking of the concrete abstract thing, is that it's not that abstract's good and concrete's bad. Because it's really easy when we have these pairings to think one side's good, one side's bad, or one side's better, one side's worse. What you're saying to me, to my way of thinking, is that we need both. And perhaps the important thing is being able to do what we've been talking about, is transverse from concrete to abstract, and then sometimes from abstract to concrete. And being able to make that movement enables moral action as much as either capacity. But we need both.
That's the idea. I mean, and necessarily, I think that somehow the concrete comes under the guidance of a more abstract notion of what it means to be a moral person. That is still something I would kind of would like to maintain, that the abstract kind of more abstract notion take guidance for kind of filling out or for making more specific what could be concrete goals to work for. I mean, and that's essentially the point from a moral point, from a developmental point of view. We cannot assume and should not assume that children do have these abstract notions of what it means to be a moral person.
Better if we don't.
And maybe also many adults do not have these more abstract notions. And here the important question comes in. So what actually brings these developments or makes these developments happen? And that's a completely different kind of problem, right? What are the factors? What are the mechanisms that propel children, teenagers to develop more abstract notions of what it means to be a good person or moral person?
Your developmental approach to this is, I think, key to all of this. I think a lot of times in social psychology, it's difficult to say, well, why would these sets of values be different or better or something than these other developmental? Well, at least there's some kind of, you never see the abstract ones earlier on. And so even though that we need both, you're saying, it seems like you're saying that, but what it's the higher ones that do the hard work in a complex world for us, you know, and that comes with development only.
That's very, I mean, you described this very well. Yes, I mean, in our world, in our complicated world, where we permanently have kind of to adjust to new situations, or we are, and here it's an interesting that Randy kind of brings up the interesting, I mean, the sustainability issue. You could say this is a completely new situation. We haven't, I mean, humanity hasn't faced these problems 50 years ago. And I mean, new, I mean, it has been around for some time, yes. I mean, but say, I mean, historically, evolutionary, it is new. And in a new situation like this, you don't really gain much if you stay on a complete concrete level. I mean, you have to have this sort of abstract kind of orientation. What does it mean to, well, lead a sustainable lifestyle or develop a sustainable lifestyle? But without this abstract notion, you are lost somehow. But then you also have to fill this in with, again, more concrete ideas on the ground. And And I think that's the way how morality very much works in a modern, complicated, complex, individualistic societies, where you basically have to figure out on your own what a general kind of idea of fairness, I don't know, honesty, kindness means in a given situation, because you never ever can teach children you always do this, does not work.
I wonder if we could just get back to the developmental issue. Yeah. I'm not a developmental psychologist, so I'm really struggling with this. And, you know, I sent out that email to everyone asking, do you think eudaimonia can exist in kids? And what I'm hearing you say is that there's the concrete versus abstract, you know, that's pretty concrete in kids. And I have the same intuition, like the questionnaire that we developed, the wording was more concrete. But what about internal versus external? I mean, what does your data say? And also for approach versus avoidance, do you find that there's at least a certain percentage of kids who are, I mean, you know, at what point does it become internal and an approach?
We currently actually do a study with kindergarten children, where we kind of especially focus on this difference between internal and external identity. We kind of give children, we explain there are two kids. They both want to be helpers, for instance, or they both want to be sharers, something like that. I mean, have a certain identity. And then there's one kid wants to be sharer because he just likes to share, or she just likes to share. And the other kid says wants to be shared because the parents like it or the teachers like it. And then we ask kids, so how about you? Are you more like this kid or more like the other kid? I mean, what is the motivation? They perfectly understand the difference. That is important. And I can tell you that, well, the younger kids clearly, it's not that they all go for the external motivation, but they do this more often. You have about 1/3 of kids who choose kind of internal responses. I like to share in a position to, because my parents like me or like it when I share. Whereas, well, about 2/3 of the young kids, 4 to 5 year olds, kind of choose more the external options. This is particularly the case when you see this very easily. I mean, we have looked this into different kind of contexts, family context, school context, when it comes to, for instance, like sharing with your siblings or not fighting with your siblings, things like that. Then you see almost all kids say, okay, I want to be sharer because my parents like me to share with my siblings. So there's also some context specificity involved. That's what I want to say. It's not just a homogeneous thing. Of course, it depends a little bit on the situation at hand. But we do see that this trend towards a more internal identity actually increases from kindergarten age to end of elementary school. So we see older children, grade 4, 5, do choose these internally motivated more identities more often as something that represents them. And yeah, now I'm a little bit careful with kind of putting kind of absolute endpoints or absolute numbers on this, because this depends a little bit on how you look at it. For me, it is really more important to say, okay, here is the developmental direction. Here is the change, or here's the direction of change we see in kids. It's hard to say, it's hard to tell, and it would be a little bit unfair, I think, to children to say, okay, they are predominantly internally motivated or externally motivated. This is the predominant mode of their identity motivation. It is certainly a mixture. And there are certain components of an internal motivation already there in younger kids. But with age, the internal part increases, becomes more important. Yeah.
Could I make a comment here, Veronica? And I think this is a point Tobias has actually made, and he'll agree with me about this. I mean, we see plenty of spontaneously we just call them altruistic acts in young children, right? Spontaneous helping behaviors. You know, where does this mean they're beginning in moral development? Well, it means they're not all selfish. I mean, they're spontaneously doing things to help other people, but they're not self-regulated in a way that would be characteristic of moral maturity, right? They're not weighing the different things. They're not sensitive to the different morally significant factors in a situation and responding to them, right, in a balanced way. They just have these spontaneous kindness, generosity, helpfulness in them. So, you know, it's not like it's all external from the beginning. There's plenty that's internal, but there has to be some process of getting them to where they're kind of responding in a balanced way. In the way I put it is sort of responding both to the wealth of moral considerations that may arise in a situation and responding to the value of everything their actions can affect, you know, in the moment. So I see kind of both of those as aspects of moral maturity, or the kind of motivation that would be characteristic of moral maturity. So that's got to be a process. So I think we're all trying to figure that out.
Yeah, but it does seem to be simpler. There's something simpler about, you use the word spontaneous, right? That's kind of like a simpler version. It's not the one, like you said, it's not sort of fully internally processed, or as SDT, you know, sort of language would put it, self-authored. It's not fully self-authored in the sense of, I really truly understand all the implications of this. You know, I understand how it fits with other aspects of my life and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
But Aristotle referred to as natural virtue, which he thought essentially,
but,
you know, we have the capacities for moral, you know, behavior, and, you know, we connect that to things like capacities for empathy or whatnot. And so they can, you know, they can give rise in these ways, but not in a structured sort of self-reflective way. That have to come online later on, but you're sort of developing capacities that you already have to some extent. So
I mean, just evolutionarily, we've just got affiliative responses that are going to be pro-social and like, or like,
it's going to show up.
Yeah, Alistair McIntyre's dependent rational animals, you know, is like this is a it's at what point that's what we're talking about, is like, at what point does it become what we think of as rational morality? And and Veronica, the ages that you're talking about in that listserv, which was great, was you know, that's this transition age of, you've got you know, somewhere around developmentally 8 to 10 years old, there's a shift in terms of how of conceptions of personhood and individuality at that age, and you're like targeting right about that age, which is really tough. It might be a really great time to see what, you know, is that when we conceive other people as persons, like apart from their roles, and how they can be different people in different roles and things like that, where we can start to differentiate these things. And then, you know, how do you come up with items for hedonic and eudaimonic motives for those? And what does that mean?
Right.
All I can say is that they're great questions.
Yeah, I think it is very important, and Randy points out it is very important to distinguish between the spontaneous acts of pro-social engagement or kindness. We do see in even very young children, they spontaneously like to help others. I mean, but then this is just a very limited kind of type of situations. I mean, and we normally do not, well, or say morality in everyday life is much more complex. And in reality, it is they often kind of somehow involve some sort of conflicts between conflicting tendencies. I mean, I want to help, at the same time, I want to keep things for myself, or I mean, at the same time, there is a friend who maybe wants special consideration and all these things. And on this level, where we need to kind of balance things out, we cannot rely on the same spontaneous kindness we see in really young children. And so there has to be on a different level this idea of an intrinsic or internal motivation that even includes conflicting situations, conflicting motivation has to, that's a different level we are talking about. That is just very important to have that clear, I think.
That's a really good way of describing it, but you don't, it's not until you've sort of been tested a little bit, right? Until you've actually come across a bit of an obstacle that you see whether you actually understand why you believe it's the right thing to, you know, like there has to be deeper processing, this reasoning behind it. Yeah.
Yeah.
This has been fun. I'm afraid I should go. It's great to see you all. And I'll see at least some of you in Manchester, I think, next month, July. Yeah.
It was great. Yeah. Great.
Thank you. Wonderful talking.
I'm signing off as well. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
I think I have the role of the host.
Yes, you do.
So thank you for coming. And Matt, I'm looking forward to talking in Manchester. Okay, very good.
Great.
Bye-bye.
All right, see you soon. Bye.
Thanks. Okay, bye.
Bye, Jack.